What is it like to be a cell? It's a funny question. So, I have this book called The Complete Cosmicomics. It was given to me by a good friend, an enigmatic earthworm named Aeophyla. And there's this story in this book about, well, there's three stories: meiosis, mitosis, meiosis, and death. And what these stories try to get at is this question of empathy, of like, I know what it's like to be me, and I can kind of imagine what it would be like to be you. You can tell me, like, oh, you know, I woke up, I went to the store, I'm really stressed out because my mother is nagging me, and you know, I can imagine what it's like to be another human. But it's trickier to imagine what it might be like to be a tree, or a jellyfish, or a lion. And what these stories that I'm about to read you try to get at is, what is it like to be the simplest of all kinds of creatures? What is it like to be a single cell? Because the truth of it is that the roots of our experience, what it's like to be a human, have to be based on those original primordial experiences of what it's like to be a cell. And we can read biology textbooks that tell us about the process of mitosis, but there have been very few attempts to actually empathize with that process, to really understand what it feels like. And I think this story is very important because it's really important to try to empathize with all of the life that exists in this world. So I'm going to read these stories. I'll provide a little bit of commentary here and there, but for the most part I want the work to stand on its own, because I think it's really, really valuable and meaningful. So now I will read the introduction, and then I'll do another video for mitosis. So if you want to skip the introduction, you can skip to the next video. Okay, here we go. So the introduction is a series of quotes by a number of scientists over the years. In asexual reproduction, the simplest entity, which is the cell, divides at a point in its growth. The nucleus divides into two equal parts, and from a single entity, two result. But we cannot say that a first entity has given birth to a second. The two new entities are, to the same degree, the products of the first. The first has disappeared. Essentially, it is dead, since only the two entities it has produced survive. It does not decompose in the way sexed animals die, but it ceases to be. It ceases to be in the sense that it is discontinuous. But in a point of the reproduction, there was a continuity. There exists a point where the primitive one becomes two. Where there are two, there is again discontinuity in each of the entities. But the passage implies an instant of continuity between the two. The first dies, but in its death appears a fundamental instant of continuity. Jorge's Batiele, Le et Strome, from the introduction. Next. All genes of the same chromosome are not always pulled into the same daughter cell, and so are not always inherited together, although they tend to be. For two homologous filaments, during their synapsis with one another, are apt to break at identical points and become joined up again with their corresponding pieces interchanged, a process called crossing over. Thus, a given gene of paternal origin may, in the mature germ shell, find itself in the same chromosome with some. Sorry, I'm gonna do that over again. I'm gonna bring this down a little bit. All right. All the genes of the same chromosome are not always pulled into the same daughter cell, and so are not always inherited together, although they tend to be. For two homologous filaments, during their synapsis with one another, are apt to break at identical points and to become joined up again with their corresponding pieces interchanged, a process called crossing over. Thus, a given gene of paternal origin may, in the mature germ cell, find itself in the same chromosome with another gene of maternal origin, instead of with its former associated gene. Encyclopedia Britannica. Gene. Still too high. In the midst of the Aeneases who carry out their Aeacises on their backs, I pass from one shore to another, alone, halting these invisible parents, hating. I'm sorry, these are hard things to read. In the midst of the Aeneases who carry their Aeacises on their backs, I pass from one shore to another, alone, hating these invisible parents astride their sons for all their life. Sartre, Les Mots. Now something from Watson and Crick. Suddenly, I became aware that an adenine-thymine pair held together by 2 hydrogen bonds was identical in shape to a guanine-cytosine pair held together by at least 2 hydrogen bonds. All the hydrogen bonds seemed to form naturally. No fudging was required to make the 2 types of base pairs identical in shape. Quickly, I called Jerry over to ask whether he had any objection to my new base pairs. When he said no, my morale skyrocketed. This type of double helix suggested a replication scheme much more satisfactory. Given the base sequence of one chain, that of its partner was automatically determined. Conceptually, it was thus very easy to visualize how a single chain could be the template for the synthesis of a chain with complementary sequence. Upon his arrival, Francis did not get more than halfway through the door before I let loose the answer that the answer to everything was in our hands. Upon his arrival, Francis did not get more than halfway through the door before I let loose that the answer to everything was in our hands. James D. Watson, The Double Helix, A Personal Account of the Structure of DNA, Chapter 26. Everything summons us to death. Nature, as if envious of the good she has done us, announces to us often and reminds us that she cannot leave us for long that bit of matter she lends us, which must not remain in the same hands, and which must eternally be in circulation. She needs it for other forms. She asks it back for other works. Bossuet, Sermon sur la Mort. One need not worry about how a fixed automaton of this sort can produce others, which are larger and more complex than itself. In this case, the greater size and the higher complexity of the object will be constructed. In this case, the greater size and higher complexity of the object to be constructed will be reflected in a presumably still greater size of the instructions that I have to be furnished. In what follows, all automata for whose construction the facility A will be used are going to share with A this property. All of them will have a place for the instruction I, that is, a place where such an instruction can be inserted. It is quite clear that the instruction I is roughly affecting the function of a gene. It is also clear that the copying mechanism B performs the fundamental act of reproduction, the duplication of genetic material, which is clearly fundamental operation in the multiplication of living cells. John von Neumann, A Theory of Automata. John von Neumann, A Theory of Automata, in Collective Works, Volume 5. So John von Neumann was a cybernetician who was obsessed with artificial life. And finally, something from Galileo. As for those who so exalt incorruptibility, inalterability, I believe they are brought to say these things through their great desire to live a long time and through the terror they have of death. And not considering that, if men were immortal, these men would have had an opportunity to come into the world. And not considering that, if men were immortal, these men would not have had an opportunity to come into the world. They would deserve to encounter a Medusa's head, which would transform them into statues of jasper or diamond, to make them more perfect than they are. And there is not the slightest doubt that the earth is far more perfect, being, as it is, alterable, changeable, than as if it were a mass of stone, or even a whole diamond, hard and impenetrable. Galileo Galilei. Dialogo sopra I due massimi sistemi, Gorniata 1. Galileo talking about the necessity of death. So, those were all a bit esoteric, and in some ways not super relevant, but in the story that is to follow, it's good to keep in mind that there were a whole bunch of non-fictional people who were thinking about these things in their own dry, systematic ways, and now we can take all of those thoughts and all of those ideas and integrate them into a piece of fiction that might actually get us to understand what was going on far better than any sort of academic textbook. Alright, so I'll see you in the next episode, next video. It'll be much more exciting than this one, I promise.